welcome to a very exciting and brand new series called Getting Off Suboxone. In this new series, I'm going to upload many training videos, as I want to be so thorough on this topic that trying to put all the information into one video would have been a monumental task. And ultimately, I believe that doing a series with many different videos on getting off Suboxone and how to get off Suboxone will be by far the best way for you to learn these strategies and tactics. The first topic we're going to cover is, what is Suboxone? Is Suboxone an opioid? And we're also going to cover the common Suboxone misconceptions and myths, and we're going to correct those so we can all start off on the right foot together. Additionally, this Getting Off Suboxone series could potentially be used by anybody that is on any other buprenorphine formulation, such as Subutex or Zubsolv, for example. Now, let's begin. Suboxone is a prescription medication containing two drugs, buprenorphine and Naloxone. Note, the ratio of these drugs in the Suboxone formulations is a 4:1 buprenorphine to Naloxone ratio. The most common dosage, though not the only one available, is Suboxone containing 8 mg buprenorphine with 2 mg Naloxone. Buprenorphine is a controlled substance and semi-synthetic opioid. Buprenorphine attaches and binds to the same opioid receptors in the brain and to other parts of the body that drugs like heroin, oxycodone, hydrocodone, morphine, and other opioids bind to. Once it attaches to these opioid receptors, buprenorphine mimics the effects of the drugs I just mentioned, though it's not as powerful. For this reason, buprenorphine is referred to as a partial opioid agonist. Here is the biochemistry definition of the word agonist. Quote, a substance that initiates a physiological response when combined with a receptor. End quote. The other opioid drugs I just mentioned are known as full opioid agonists because they activate the opioid receptors in a stronger and more complete way than buprenorphine. Naloxone is the other drug present in Suboxone. Naloxone is a pure opioid antagonist, and here's the biochemistry definition of antagonist. Quote, a substance that interferes with or inhibits the physiological action of another. End quote. You may have heard of a naloxone shot or nasal spray, brand name Narcan, which is the drug given to people that overdose on opioids because an injection of naloxone puts the opioid user into instant withdrawal, thus saving them from health issues and death. Naloxone used intravenously will lead to the opioids in a person's receptors being immediately kicked out by the naloxone, and for this reason, it can save lives by preventing people that have overdosed from dying. My life was saved, for example, by getting a naloxone shot after I took a lethal, synergistic dosage of methadone and Valium together. I had overdosed and was about a minute or two away from death when an ambulance arrived on the scene and an EMT gave me a naloxone shot and saved my life. At this point, you may be wondering why naloxone was put in the Suboxone formulation if buprenorphine is an opioid, and the point is to keep the opioid drug in the receptors and not to push it out of the receptors. Don't worry, I promise there's a really good reason for naloxone being added to the Suboxone medication. Used intravenously, such as with a naloxone shot, naloxone works amazingly well. But used sublingually, under the tongue, as it's used in the Suboxone formulation, naloxone has basically no bioavailability. This means that when you use Suboxone sublingually, as prescribed, you only get the opioid effects from the buprenorphine, and you don't experience effects from the naloxone. Naloxone was added to the Suboxone medication to deter people from injecting Suboxone. Subutex, a brand name medication that only contains buprenorphine without the addition of naloxone, can be injected and thus abused. If an individual injects Suboxone, the addition of the opioid antagonist naloxone will now be bioavailable and will cause the person to get very sick, as they will go into an immediate naloxone precipitated withdrawal, which is way worse than the normal acute opioid withdrawal typically. And speaking of precipitated withdrawal, this is really a great chance to teach you about two common misconceptions about Suboxone. Many people, even many treatment professionals, believe the following two Suboxone misconceptions. Suboxone misconception number 1. If you use Suboxone too soon after your last dose of an opioid, the naloxone in the medication will cause you to go into precipitated withdrawal. The truth. Used orally, the naloxone present in Suboxone has basically no bioavailability and thus cannot cause a precipitated withdrawal. Naloxone needs to be used intravenously or as a nasal spray to work. The truth is that buprenorphine has a very strong binding affinity but a low intrinsic value at the mu opioid receptors. Thus, if you've been taking a full opioid agonist, such as hydrocodone or oxycodone, heroin, methadone, or one of the many others, the buprenorphine will kick out the full opioid agonists from your receptors and not activate the receptors with the same amount of power, since buprenorphine is only a partial agonist and not a full agonist. This results in a net decrease in opioid receptor stimulation and activation, leading blood opioid concentrations to fall below the required level to satisfy your opioid-dependent neurons, thus causing a buprenorphine-precipitated, not naloxone-precipitated, withdrawal syndrome. Suboxone misconception number 2. It is the naloxone present in Suboxone that will block out the effects of other opioids if you use other opioids while you're already on daily Suboxone. The truth. Since naloxone is not bioavailable when used sublingually, such as in the Suboxone formulation, it cannot be the naloxone that blocks out the opioids. However, since buprenorphine has such a high binding affinity for the mu opioid receptors, I like to call it very sticky, very magnetic to the receptors. It's actually the buprenorphine which effectively blocks out any other opioids from getting in the receptors and thus prevents a high from other opioids while a person has adequate levels of buprenorphine in their opioid receptors. So at this point, either your brain is hurting or you've digested this information well, or somewhere in between. In either case, the following definition of opioid, along with a bullet point breakdown of the broad classes of opioids, should solidify your understanding of this concept. An opioid is any agent that binds to opioid receptors, which are protein molecules located on the membranes of some nerve cells, found principally in the central nervous system and gastrointestinal tract, and elicits a response. There are 4 broad classes of opioids. 1. Endogenous opioid, that is, naturally produced in the body, endorphins and enkephalins. Number 2. Opium alkaloids, such as morphine and codeine, which are naturally occurring from the opium poppy plant. 3. Semi-synthetic opioids, such as heroin, oxycodone, and buprenorphine. And 4. Fully synthetic opioids, such as methadone, that have structures unrelated to the opium alkaloids. As you can surmount from the bullet point list covered, buprenorphine is an opioid in the specific category of semi-synthetic opioids. Here's the definition of the term semi-synthetic. Quote, of a substance made by synthesis from a naturally occurring material. So to sum things up, buprenorphine is not a naturally occurring opiate, such as morphine and codeine, which are both present in the opium poppy plant. However, buprenorphine is a drug created by scientists that used some of the natural alkaloids present in the opium poppy. Buprenorphine is a semi-synthetic analog of thebaine. Thebaine, also known as codeine methyl enol ether, is an opiate alkaloid which is a minor constituent of opium. Thebaine is chemically similar to both morphine and codeine, but has stimulatory rather than depressant effects, which could be a reason why so many people report getting energy from Suboxone. While thebaine is not used therapeutically, it is the main alkaloid extracted from Papaver bracteatum, Iranian poppy, and can be converted industrially into a variety of compounds, including oxycodone, oxymorphone, and yes, buprenorphine. Buprenorphine is considered a sustained action, also known as long-acting, opioid because the effects come on very slowly, slow onset, and the buprenorphine wears off very slowly as well, slow offset, making it an ideal opioid replacement medication for medication-assisted treatment of opioid use disorder and opioid dependence. However, since buprenorphine is an opioid, this means that while the user gets temporary relief while taking Suboxone, getting off the medication can be very hard for certain individuals, since it's still an opioid, and quite a powerful one at that. So, is Suboxone an opioid? Well, the short answer is yes, and now you know the long answer as well. By the way, if you've listened to every single part of this video rather than just skimming it, you're a total nerd just like me. But even if you just skimmed this video, I love you anyway. If you have any comments or questions on the topic of what is Suboxone an opioid, feel free to post them in the comment box below. And stay tuned for video 2 of the Getting Off Suboxone series coming out very soon.